I want to tell you about the strangest instruction my mother-in-law ever gave. On my wedding day, she pulled my husband aside during the reception, squeezed his arm, and whispered something in Pennsylvania Dutch. Years later, he told me what she said. If she gets scared tonight, just be patient. She'll settle. That was it. No mystery. Bag. No ancient incantation. Just a mother telling her son that fear was normal and patience was the cure. But what she didn't say, what she couldn't say because she had no framework for it, was what happens when patience runs out and the fear doesn't settle. What happens when two people who have never been alone together are suddenly locked in a room with the expectation that they will figure everything out before the rooster crows. That is what I am going to talk about today. Not a universal Amish experience, because there is no such thing. Just mine. One woman, one district, one night that lasted longer than it should have. Welcome to the channel. I share stories from inside communities that don't often open their doors to outsiders. If that sounds like your kind of thing, stick around. Let me take you back to the afternoon before the wedding. I was 19, standing barefoot on cold kitchen linoleum, while my mother and 3 aunts moved around me like women preparing a complicated meal. They weren't cruel. My mother hummed hymns while she pinned the hem of my blue dress. My Aunt Miriam, who had birthed 9 children, and lost 2, kept patting my cheek and saying, "You'll learn, little bird." We all learned. I thought she meant running a household. I was wrong. My mother sat me down on a kitchen chair, took both my hands, and said something that I've turned over in my mind 1,000 times since. "He'll be nervous. You just be still. That's the main thing. Just be still." She paused, like she wanted to add something else, then shook her head and squeezed my fingers. That was my sex education. Be still. But there was another moment that day that I've never told anyone. After my mother left the room, my Aunt Miriam lingered. She was the oldest of the women, widowed young, never remarried. She had a face like a weathered barn, all hard lines and soft eyes. She sat down heavily in the chair my mother had vacated and looked at me for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, "They don't tell us anything, you know. They just push you in and hope you swim." I didn't know what to say. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small jar of salve, the kind we used for chapped hands in winter. She pressed it into my palm and closed my fingers around it. "For after," she said, "it helps with the soreness." Then she stood up and left before I could thank her. That jar sat on my nightstand for weeks. I never used it. I was too embarrassed, but I kept it. I still have it somewhere, in a box of things I couldn't throw away. That was the only honest advice I received, a jar of hand salve, and a warning that no one teaches you to swim. Now, I want to ask you something, and then I'll step back and let the story unfold. If you had 5 minutes with a 19-year-old who has never seen a diagram of her own body, never heard the word consent, never been alone in a room with a man, what would you say? What words would you choose? It's harder than you think. The wedding was beautiful in a stark way. 300 people on backless benches, a sermon that lasted 2 hours, circling themes of submission and fruitfulness. The bishop, a man I'd known since childhood, used the word furrow while describing the marriage bed. I stared at my lap. Levi, my husband-to-be, sat beside me, and I could see his hands trembling slightly in his good black coat. He looked like a boy playing dress-up. I'd known him since we were children stealing sugar cookies from his mother's cooling rack. I knew the shape of his laugh. I didn't know the shape of his fear, and he was afraid. I could smell it on him, a sharp, anxious sweat cutting through the roasted chicken and bread. There is a moment from that ceremony that I return too often, during one of the long prayers, where everyone kneels on the hard floor and the bishop speaks in High German. Levi shifted slightly and his elbow brushed mine, just barely, a feather touch through layers of wool and cotton, and I felt it in my entire body, this electric jolt of recognition. This is real. This is happening. I am about to become his wife. I remember sneaking a glance at his profile, the way his jaw was clenched, the way a single bead of sweat traced a path down his temple. I wanted to reach over and take his hand, but you don't do that. Not in church, not in front of 300 witnesses. So I just knelt there, feeling the ghost of his elbow on my skin, and tried to memorize the feeling. I think about that moment a lot, the last innocent touch before everything got complicated. After the ceremony came the feast. long tables groaning under casseroles and roasted chickens and fresh bread and pies. So many pies. The women had been baking for days. I remember watching Levi from across the barn. He was surrounded by his brothers and cousins, all of them laughing too loudly, slapping his back, making jokes I couldn't hear but could definitely imagine, the groom's jokes, the ones about plowing fields and planting seeds and hoping for a good harvest. I saw Levi's face go red, saw him duck his head and mumble something that made the other men roar. I felt a flash of anger on his behalf. They were embarrassing him, but I also felt a cold thread of fear. Because whatever they were saying, it was about me too, about what we were supposed to do when the barn emptied and the lamps were lit. After the feast came hours of cleanup. Levi and I barely spoke. We kept catching each other's eyes and looking away fast, the way you do when you're standing on the edge of something you can't undo. I remember washing dishes in a tin basin, my hands red and raw from hot water, and feeling his presence across the room. He was stacking benches with my brothers. Every few minutes I'd feel his gaze on the back of my neck, and I'd turn, and he'd already be looking away. This strange, quiet dance of almost connection. I wanted to talk to him. I wanted to say, "Are you as scared as I am?" But there was no space for that conversation, no privacy, no precedent. Sometime after 11, his mother appeared beside me and said, "Time, daughter." Not my name, daughter. I was being folded into a roll before I'd even climbed the stairs. The bedroom had been prepared, a double bed with a new straw mattress, a white sheet, a quilt in the wedding ring pattern I'd sewn myself during the long winter evenings. Of my engagement, each stitch a small prayer for happiness, a kerosene lamp burning on the dresser. No mirror. Mirrors were vanity. I wouldn't see my own face as a wife until weeks later, when I caught my reflection in a rain barrel and startled myself. Who was that woman with the tired eyes? I didn't recognize her. Levi came in behind me, closed the door. The click of the latch was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. In the lamplight he looked as terrified as I felt. We stood there for what felt like an hour, just looking at each other. Neither of us knew the choreography. Were we supposed to undress? Should I turn around? Should he? There was no manual for this. No one had taught us how to begin. Finally, he cleared his throat and said, "My brother told me something." He stopped, swallowed, started again. He said it hurts you the first time, but only if you don't relax right. He sort of shrugged, helpless, like he was apologizing for words that weren't even his. That was the sum total of his sexual education. If it hurt, I had failed to relax properly. The responsibility for a painless experience was already mine, and I had no idea what I was supposed to do differently. I want to describe the room more fully because the sensory details have stayed with me like a photograph. The bed was against the wall, under a window that looked out onto the cornfield. The glass was old, wavy, the kind that distorts the world outside. The mattress was new, stuffed with fresh straw that crackled every time you moved. The pillowcases were embroidered with small flowers, a project I had completed when I was 16, never imagining the context in which they'd be used. The kerosene lamp cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, and there was a clock, a wind-up clock on the dresser, ticking loudly. Tick, tick, tick. I focused on that sound. It became my anchor. As long as the clock was ticking, time was passing. And if time was passing, eventually the night would end. What followed wasn't a violent assault. It was slower and in some ways more confusing. Levi was gentle in his movements, almost hesitant. He kept asking, "You okay?" in this tight, nervous voice. But he never stopped, and I never told him to stop because I didn't know I could. The idea that I had authority over what happened to my body in that room had never been presented to me. Not once. Not by my mother. Not by my aunts. Not by the bishop. Not by God. My body was a gift, and you can't take back. A gift. So when the pain came, sharp and burning and nothing like I had imagined, I bit the inside of my cheek and breathed through my nose and started counting ceiling beams. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I can still see the grain of that wood if I close my eyes. There was a knot in the third beam, shaped like a bird in flight. I stared at that knot for hours. I want to pause here and tell you something I've never said out loud. Around 2 in the morning, maybe later, Levi stopped moving and looked down at me. His face was strange, caught between confusion and something else. "You're crying," he said. I hadn't noticed. Tears were running sideways into my hair, pooling in my ears. He reached down and wiped one away with his thumb, very gently. The touch was so tender it made my chest ache. Then he said, "Do you want me to?" "Should I?" He trailed off, didn't finish the sentence. And I looked at him, this man who once carved me a tiny wooden horse when I was sick and couldn't play outside, this man who walked 3 miles through a snowstorm for a 10-year-old girl with a fever. He was giving me an opening, a crack in the door, and I closed it myself. I shook my head and whispered, "It's fine, go ahead." Why did I say that? Not because I wanted to keep going, because I had been so thoroughly taught that endurance was holy that I couldn't imagine saying yes to my own relief. That moment, that tiny fracture where I could have spoken and didn't, haunts me more than anything else that happened that night. Not what he did, what I didn't do. But here's the part that's easy to miss. Levi was trapped too. He wasn't acting out of cruelty. He was acting out of a desperate, bone-deep terror that if he failed to consummate the marriage, it could be seen as a sign of God's disfavor. He'd heard stories. We all had. A couple 3 districts over whose marriage was annulled after. No pregnancy. Annulment meant shunning. Shunning meant losing your family, your work, your entire world. Your mother wouldn't look at you. Your father wouldn't speak your name. You became a ghost while still alive. So he kept going, not because he wanted to hurt me, but because the alternative felt like a death sentence. And I lay beneath him, both of us pinned under the weight of a system that had turned our bodies into instruments of survival. Neither of us was free. We just had different cages. The lamp burned out around 4 in the morning. The kerosene ran dry, and the room plunged into absolute darkness. No streetlights outside, no power lines, just blackness so complete I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. The ticking clock seemed louder in the dark, and in that darkness, something shifted. Levi stopped. He lay down beside me, breathing hard. After a long silence, he started talking. Not about duty, not about God. He told me about the first time he saw me, at a Sunday singing when I was 15. I was wearing a green dress, he said. He remembered the color. He said he'd been too nervous to talk to me, so he'd written a letter he never sent. Still had it, actually, folded up in his Bible, tucked behind the Book of Ruth. "It's probably dumb," he said, "keeping a letter you never sent, for years, and I never had the guts to give it to you." I remember exactly how he said it, awkward, quiet, like he was confessing something mildly embarrassing, not handing me a piece of his heart he'd been carrying for years. And for the first time that night, I spoke honestly. "I'm scared too." 3 words, the truest thing I'd said all day. We lay there in the dark, holding hands like 2 children lost in a forest, and for maybe 20 minutes, we weren't husband and wife. We were just Levi and me, 2 kids who had grown up in adjacent farmhouses, who had never been taught how to talk about fear or bodies or desire. That memory lives right next to the painful ones. I still don't know how to hold both at the same time. Maybe I'm not supposed to figure it out. Maybe holding both is the whole point. Then the gray light started seeping under the door. The world outside was waking up. Birds beginning their morning arguments. A horse snorting in the barn. And Levi, as if remembering his lines in a play, sat up and said, "We should probably, before people wake up." The 20 minutes of connection were over. The performance resumed. I remember the rooster crowing just as he finished, that harsh, triumphant scream cutting through the dawn, and I felt this wave of relief so intense it made me dizzy. Dawn. The night was over. I had survived, and my first feeling wasn't pain. It was shame that I felt relieved, shame that I had wished the hours away, shame that my wedding night, which was supposed to be sacred, had become something I just wanted to end. The morning after was all performance. I put on my blue dress, the one I'd wear every Sunday for years, and walked downstairs. The house was full. My mother flipping pancakes, her face flushed from the wood stove. Little sisters running between the legs of adults, shrieking with laughter. Men drinking coffee from heavy ceramic mugs. And talking about crop yields and weather patterns. I moved through the kitchen like a ghost, and no one looked at me directly. No one except my mother, who caught my elbow as I reached for a plate. Her grip was firm. She leaned close and said, very quietly, Was it okay? Not are you okay? Not how do you feel? Was it okay? I looked at her, This woman who had borne 11 children, whose body had been a field for decades, and I saw in her eyes something I was too young to name then, a deep, ancient fatigue, the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. I said, "Yes." She nodded once and let go of my elbow. That was my marriage's first morning. Pancakes and performance and a single word of confirmation that the system was still working. Let me be clear about something. What I'm describing is my experience. Not every Amish wedding night looks like this. The Amish world is vast, dozens of affiliations, hundreds of districts, thousands of families. I've heard stories from other former Amish women whose husbands held them all night and never did more than kiss their foreheads and whisper promises. I've also heard stories far worse than mine, stories I won't repeat because they're not mine to tell. The point isn't that my experience is universal. The point is that it's possible, that a system with no sex education, no vocabulary for boundaries, and a theology that frames female submission as righteousness can produce nights like this. And it does, quietly, often, behind those white curtains and buggy wheels. There are women counting ceiling beams right now. Months later, I started noticing something strange. During intimacy, I would float away in my head. I'd count things, ceiling beams, quilt squares, stitches in the pillowcase, the ticking of the clock. I thought I was broken, a cold woman, a bad wife. I would lie there and wonder what was wrong with me, why I couldn't be present, why. My body was in one place and my mind was somewhere else entirely. I started dreading the nights, not because of Levi, because of me, because I felt like I was watching myself from a great distance and I couldn't find my way back. It wasn't until years later, sitting in a cramped therapist's office in the English world, that I heard the word dissociation for the first time. I remember how that office smelled, stale coffee and lavender air freshener. The therapist had a plant on her desk, one of those hardy ones that's hard to kill, the kind that survives neglect. She explained it slowly, watching my face, pausing to make sure I was following. Your brain learned to protect you by leaving your body when you felt trapped. That's not brokenness. That's a survival reflex. Your mind loved you enough to shield you. I sat there for a long time without speaking. Then I started crying, not sobbing, just tears running down my face while I stared at that impossible plant. I had spent years carrying shame. For a reflex that was actually proof my mind loved me enough to protect me. That moment was a quiet resurrection. I walked out of that office feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly. Something smaller. Something that might have been hope. And here's the part that complicates everything. I still loved Levi. I still do, in a way that feels like grief. He wasn't a villain. He was a boy handed a rule book that told him persistence was virtue, and he followed it. He was also the boy who brought me soup when I was sick during our engagement, who remembered that I liked extra cinnamon on my oatmeal, who once fixed a loose board on my father's porch without being asked because he noticed it was wobbly. When I finally left, 2 years later, I packed a single suitcase while he sat at the kitchen table. He didn't try to stop me. He didn't argue or plead or quote scripture. He just sat there, holding his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim, a nervous habit he'd had since childhood. I stood in the doorway, suitcase in hand, and looked back at him. He said, "I hope you—" Yeah, he didn't finish, just nodded once and looked down at the table. I walked out. I haven't seen him since, but I think about him more than I expected to. I think about how the system starved him of emotional language too, how it shaped his impulses into something he didn't recognize as harmful, how he was also a victim of a culture that doesn't teach boys how to ask or girls how to answer. Holding anger and compassion in the same breath is the truest part of this story. I'm still learning how to do it. I have a small wooden horse on my bookshelf. It's crudely carved. The legs are uneven, one shorter than the others, so it wobbles if you touch it. The mane is just a series of knife marks, a child's attempt at detail. Levi made it for me when I was 10 and sick with a fever. He was 12. He walked 3 miles in the snow to deliver it because he'd heard I was unwell. My mother brought it to my room, still cold from his pocket, and said, "The Fisher boy brought this for you." Didn't even stay for cocoa. I put that horse on my windowsill and kept it there for years, through my entire childhood, through Rumspringa, through the wedding. When I left, it was one of the few things I took. That boy, The one who carved horses and walked through snowstorms for a sick friend is the same boy who locked the door and didn't stop when I cried. And I am the same girl who treasured that horse, and the same woman who still keeps it on a shelf where I can see it every day. It wobbles when I dust it. The wood is dark with age now, smooth in places where I've touched it over the years. Some nights I look at it. Some nights I pick it up and hold it in my palm and try to hold both truths at once. The boy who walked through snow, the man who didn't stop, the girl who loved him, the woman who left. Some memories can hold both love and pain. That's the only wisdom I have. Thank you for listening. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who might need it. I'll be back soon with another story from the hidden corners of lived experience. Until then, be gentle with the people around you. You never know what ceiling beams they count at night.